The needle moved through light the way it would move through water, if water could hum. Emma's fingertips were steady because they had to be. The thing on her lap could not afford trembling. She drew the thread taut and watched a small constellation come loose from the wolf's flank. 3 pinpricks of cold fire drifting up past her chin before they thinned into nothing. The wound under her hands was a tear in something that should not have been terrible. A seam along the ribs where light leaked the way breath leaks from a punctured lung. She had tried linen first, 9 weeks ago, and the cloth had slid through the creature as if it were mist. She had tried silk. She had tried the priestess's blessed gauze stolen in the dark from a locked cupboard. None of it had held. Only the thread soaked in her own blood had caught at the wolf's edges and stayed, knitting luminous fur to luminous fur in a stitch no scholar had ever written down. The undercroft smelled of cold stone and tallow, and the faint sweet ozone of a body made partly of stars. She worked by the wolf's own glow, because the candle had guttered hours ago, and she had not dared go up for another. Her knees ached against the flags. Her shoulder ached from holding her arm at the angle the wound required. The collar at her throat ached too, the way it always ached, a low band of iron heat that flared whenever she tried to form a sound. She did not try. She had not tried in 3 years. She pulled the thread through, snipped it with the small knife she kept tucked in her apron seam, and pressed her palm flat to the wolf's side to feel the breath. It was there. Shallow. Patient. The wolf's eye opened, a pale, unbearable thing the color of the moment before dawn, and looked at her without surprise. Above them, somewhere in the keep's tall throat, a horn sounded. Emma's hand stilled. She knew that horn. Every servant in the keep knew it. The Alpha King had returned. The Starlight wolf knew it too, evidently, because the slow drift of stars across its coat quickened, and one of them, a small bright thing the size of a pea, broke free and floated up past Emma's mouth and settled, weightless, on her lower lip. She did not move. She could not have spoken even if her throat had been free. The star sat there a moment, warm in a way nothing had been warm against her mouth in 3 years. And then it lifted and drifted back to the wolf's coat and resumed its slow orbit. The horn sounded again, 3 long notes for a king returning whole. Emma let her breath out through her nose. She lowered her forehead until it touched the wolf's temple. Whatever this was, whatever she had done by accident in the dark of a forgotten cellar 9 weeks ago, when she had heard the small wet sound of something dying and gone toward it instead of away, it was about to stop being hers. She had known that from the first stitch. She had known it and stitched anyway, because the thing on her lap had been alone, and she knew what alone felt like in a stone room with no voice. Footsteps moved across a floor far above. The wolf's tail, a slow rope of drifting light, curled once around her ankle. From a fold in the wolf's neck fur, a small moth with luminous wings stirred, opened them, closed them, and settled again. It had come down 2 nights ago, in the sleeve of the elder scholar Garland when he had paid his weekly visit to inspect, in his words, the progress of the experiment. The moth had flown from his sleeve to the wolf's coat and had not gone back. Emma had noticed. Garland had not. Emma noticed a great many things Garland did not. She had 9 weeks of noticing folded under her tongue, and no tongue to spend them with. She sat very still in the cold and listened to the keep wake up around the news of its king. And she counted, in the careful private way she counted everything now, the stitches still left to close, and the hours until someone thought to look for the missing girl who carried the chamber pots, and the number of stars that had begun, over the last 3 nights to slow their drift across the wolf's flank, as if they were no longer entirely sure which body they belonged to. Jamie came down the Undercroft stairs alone, because the priestess had told him to come alone, and because the priestess had spoken in the voice she used only twice in her life, the voice that meant a thing was happening that the council had not arranged. He had not bathed, he had not eaten, he had ridden through 2 changes of horse and the last hour through driven sleet, and the council had met him in the great hall with 9 veiled daughters arranged like a line of cut flowers, and a 10th standing apart in a treaty gown the color of old wine. And he had looked at all 10 of them and felt nothing at all, which was not unusual. And then the priestess had stepped between him and the line and said, "Lo, the Starlight Wolf has already come, my king, and it is not here." He had followed her without speaking. He had taken a torch from the wall and gone down the stairs 2 at a time, and now stood at the bottom in the dim and saw, first, a woman. She was small. She was kneeling. Her hair was the dull brown of unwashed wheat, and her dress had been gray once and was now mostly stains. And there was a wide, flat collar of dark iron around her throat, with a rune carved into its front that he recognized at once with a cold, sliding feeling at the base of his skull, because he had seen that mark before in one of Garland's books, and he had been told it was a relic mark, harmless, decorative. Across the woman's lap lay the Starlight Wolf. He had seen it once before in his life, when he was 11, the year his mother had been chosen. It had been larger then, or he had been smaller. It was the same creature. The luminous head was tucked against the woman's throat, just above the iron of the collar, and the stars that drifted from its coat were not drifting anymore. They were turning, slowly in a wide, soft wheel around her. She had heard him come down. She did not look up. Her hands stayed flat on the wolf's side, one near the ribs, one near the heart, and he understood in a slow, shocked rush that she was holding the creature together with the pressure of her palms. He moved closer. She still did not look up. The wolf did. The wolf's eye found him and held him, and he felt, for the first time in 5 years of war, something inside his chest tilt over and lie down. Jamie knelt. He set the torch in the bracket by the wall. He did not know what to say to a woman who held a god in her lap. "How long?" he said, and his voice came out hoarse from the cold and the road. She lifted one hand from the wolf's heart, slowly so as not to disrupt the orbit of stars, and showed him 9 fingers, closed them, showed him 9 again. He counted in his head. Weeks. She nodded once. He looked at the collar. He looked at the rust-dark thread between her fingers. He looked at her hands, which were latticed with small old cuts at the pads of the fingers, and one fresh one along the side of her thumb, still beating. He understood the thread. He did not yet understand the collar, or rather, he understood it too well, and was refusing the understanding until he had to take it. "Your name." Her mouth moved. No sound came. The iron at her throat warmed visibly, a low band of heat that lifted the fine hair at her nape. She closed her mouth again and reached, with the hand not holding the wolf, into her apron, and drew out a scrap of slate the size of her palm and a stub of chalk, and wrote in a small, neat hand, "Emma." He read it. He looked at her face for the first time properly. She had a plain face, tired, the kind of plain that was only plain because no one had ever bothered to look at it in good light. Her eyes were gray and very steady, and they were not afraid of him, which he registered as remarkable, because everyone in the keep was afraid of him. even the ones who loved him. "Emma," he said. The wolf, against her throat, made a low, contented sound that was not quite a sound, more a vibration in the stones. From somewhere in its fur, a small luminous moth lifted, circled once around Jamie's torch, and returned to settle on the back of Emma's wrist. Jamie watched the moth. He had seen that moth before, too. He had seen it 3 days ago in Garland's study, perched on the rim of an inkwell while Garland explained, with his hands folded the way he always folded them, that the selection rite would proceed exactly as planned, my king. Exactly as we have always done. Jamie's jaw set. He did not let it show in his face. He had not become king of anything by letting things show in his face. He looked back at Emma and he said, more quietly, "Did anyone do this to you?" He meant the collar. She understood he meant the collar. She held his eyes a long moment, and then she wrote one word on the slate and turned it toward him. "Yes." He breathed out. He did not ask who. Not yet. He reached, slowly, the way a man reaches toward a horse that has been beaten, and laid the flat of his hand on the wolf's shoulder beside hers. The wolf did not stir. The stars kept turning. And under his palm, faint as a struck tuning fork pressed to the back of his teeth, he felt a thin, clear ringing begin in his jaw, and saw, from the way Emma's chin lifted 1/2 inch, that she felt it too, and had felt it before, and had been told nothing about it by anyone because there had been no one to tell. She had been 17 the year a minor lord from the eastern border had ridden into her village with 6 men and a parchment, and named her his by ancient right. And she had said no in front of her father and her mother and her younger brother Reese and the village priest and the entire square, and the lord had ridden away smiling, and the collar had come 3 nights later, in a velvet box carried by a man she did not know, with a letter sealed by the elder scholar Garland of the High Council, who in his careful hand had written that since she had refused the bond freely offered, the kingdom in its mercy would offer her the alternative of service, and the collar would ensure she did not slander the Lord's name in her bitterness, and she would be conveyed to the keep to take up the duties of a chamber girl, and she should consider herself fortunate, for the older punishment for refusal was the rope. Her mother had wept. Her father had not. Reese, who was 9, had asked why she could not just say sorry, and she had knelt and kissed his hair and not been able to tell him, because the man had already fastened the collar at her throat, and the first attempt at sorry had come out as a small, dry click and a smell of burning. She had been at the keep 3 years. She had carried slop buckets and ash pails and laundry and once, memorably, a tureen of stew across a banquet hall where 2 dukes were arguing, and no one had ever looked at her face. She had learned the keep the way a mouse learns a wall, by the seams. She had found the undercroft her first month, because the head housekeeper, Sally, who was the only person in the keep who had ever spoken to her like a person, had told her quietly that if she ever needed to cry where no one could hear, the back stair past the wine cellar went down to a place no one bothered with, and Sally had said it without quite looking at her, and Emma had understood. She had cried there once, the first week. After that, she had simply gone there to breathe. 9 weeks ago, she had gone down with a stub of candle to mend a tear in her apron, and had heard, from the dark beyond the candle's reach, a sound like a wet star going out. She had gone toward it. She had found the wolf curled in a pool of its own scattered light, a long, ragged tear down its flank, and she had set down the candle and the apron and gone back up the stairs at a careful walk so as not to attract attention. And she had taken from the laundry cupboard a roll of clean linen and a needle and the spool of fine waxed thread the seamstress used for hems, and she had come back down. The linen had slid through. The wolf had watched her with one pale eye while she tried. She had bitten her thumb without meaning to, frustrated, and a drop of her blood had fallen on the thread, and she had pulled the thread through almost absently, and it had caught. She had understood at once, the way she understood most things, without anyone needing to tell her. She had pricked her finger deliberately the next time. The wolf had let her. 9 weeks. She had brought it half her bread each night. She had brought it the cold tea no one drank. She had stitched and stitched, an inch at a time, because the tear was long and the thread was slow, and her blood was finite. She had not told Sally. She had not told anyone. She did not have anyone to tell. She had begun, somewhere in the 4th week, to think of the wolf as her secret in a way she had not had a secret since she was a child, and the thought had made her almost happy in a small, grim way, and then had frightened her because she had learned that anything she loved could be used. Garland had come down on the 7th week. She had heard him on the stair and had pressed herself flat behind a pillar and watched him pause at the threshold of the chamber where the wolf lay, and lift his lamp and stare, and then turn and go back up without speaking. And she had understood, with the same fast, cold clarity she had understood the collar, that he had been looking for it, that he had known it would come, that the wound on its flank was not accidental. She had not slept that night. She had come down at the first bell with a fresh needle and her thumb already bleeding, and she had stitched faster, and the wolf had pressed its head against her sternum and breathed, and she had thought, without words, because she could not think in words anymore without the iron flaring. You are not his. You will not be his. I do not know what I am promising you. I am promising it anyway. The court came down the stair in a slow, ungainly procession that Emma heard before she saw. The rustle of 9 bridal skirts and the heavier tread of counselors and the careful boots of the priestess. And Jamie stood when he heard them coming and put his body between the stair and her, which she noted and filed and did not yet permit herself to feel. The priestess came first. She was an old woman with white hair cropped short like a soldier's and a staff of pale wood. And when she saw the wolf across Emma's lap, she stopped on the bottom step and made a small sound in her throat and went to one knee. The 9 bridal candidates came after her in a confused cluster, and the treaty bride came last, a tall, pale girl with red hair braided like a crown, who looked once at the wolf and once at Emma, and once at Jamie's back, and then stepped sideways out of the line and stood by the wall with her hands folded, which Emma also noted. The counselors came last. Garland was among them. Emma saw him the instant his lamp caught the stones. He did not look at her. He looked at the wolf. His face did the thing a face does when a man has been waiting 30 years for a moment, and the moment is not arriving the way he planned. It was very brief. He covered it. He folded his hands in front of him in the gesture she had come to know, and stepped forward and said, in the gentle, scholarly voice he used in council, "My king, this is a great wonder, but the rite requires the wolf to come to the hall and to walk the line." The priestess did not stand up. She said from her knee, "The rite requires the wolf to choose. The wolf has chosen." Garland inclined his head, patient. "With respect, mother. The choosing must be witnessed in the proper place by the proper—" "It has been witnessed," the priestess said. "It is being witnessed now. By me. By the king. By every soul on this stair." One of the bridal candidates began to cry quietly. Another, a dark-haired girl Emma had once served wine to, looked at Emma with an expression that was not jealousy, but a kind of stunned relief, and Emma filed that too. Garland turned to Jamie. "My king, The girl is a mute servant. She wears a punishment collar. The wolf is wounded, perhaps confused. If you would permit me to examine. Jaime did not turn around. No. The word landed in the stone room like a dropped sword. Garland did not flinch. He was too old and too clever to flinch. He smiled faintly, the way a tutor smiles at a student making a charming error. My king, I have studied these creatures for 30 years. I am the only man in this keep who... I said no. Jaime's voice was very quiet. Step back from the stair, Garland. Garland stepped back. Not because he had been told to. Because the priestess had risen, slowly, to her full, small height, and was looking at him with the kind of expression an old woman wears when she has just understood a thing she does not yet have evidence for. The priestess walked across the floor to Emma. She knelt again, this time on the flagstones beside her, and she looked at the wolf, and she looked at the collar, and she said softly, "Child, may I?" Emma nodded. The priestess laid 2 fingers very lightly against the iron at Emma's throat, closed her eyes, opened them, looked at Garland over her shoulder for 1 long second, and then looked back at Emma and said, even more softly, "Who put this on you?" Emma reached for her slate. The chalk wavered once in her hand. She wrote a name. She turned the slate so the priestess could see it, and no one else. The priestess read it. Her mouth thinned. She nodded once. She covered the slate with her palm, and the chalk smudged into nothing under her hand. And she said, loud enough for the room, "The Starlight Wolf has chosen its Luna. Her name is Emma. The ceremony is concluded. Clear the undercroft." The counselors did not move. The bridal candidates did not move. Garland did not move. Jaime, who had not turned his back on Garland once in the whole exchange, said in the same quiet voice, "You heard the mother. Clear the undercroft." They cleared. Slowly. The treaty bride was the first to go, and Emma saw her, on the stair, pause and look back, and incline her head. A small, precise courtesy from one woman to another, and then she was gone. The bridal candidates went after her in a confused, weeping knot. The counselors filed up. Garland went last. At the foot of the stair he stopped and turned, and looked at Emma for the first time, and smiled and said very gently, "Welcome, my lady. We have much to discuss in the coming days." Then he climbed the stairs and was gone. Emma watched him go. She did not move her hands from the wolf. When his footsteps had passed beyond hearing, she reached with one finger and touched the small luminous moth that had been sitting on her wrist the whole time, and the moth lifted and flew once around Jamie's head and came back to her shoulder and stayed. Jamie carried her up the stairs. She had tried to walk. She had stood slowly with the wolf shifting itself off her lap of its own accord and pacing the chamber on long, noiseless paws, and her knees had given out under her like wet rope, because she had been kneeling on stone for 9 hours, and she had bled herself a thumbnail's worth, and she had not eaten since the bread she had given the wolf the night before. And Jamie had caught her before she hit the floor, and lifted her without asking, and carried her up. The wolf walked at his heel. The moth rode on her shoulder. The priestess went ahead with her staff held like a warning. They did not pass through the great hall. The priestess led them up a back stair Emma had not known existed, and along a corridor lined with old tapestries, and into a chamber Emma had never been in, with a hearth already burning, and a copper bath already steaming, and 3 women already waiting. And Sally was one of them. Sally took one look at Emma in Jamie's arms, and put a hand over her own mouth, and then took it down again and crossed the room and said brisk, "Set her down by the fire. My king, she's blue." Jamie set her down. Sally knelt and chafed her hands and did not weep, because Sally had not wept since her husband died 10 years ago. But her jaw worked. The priestess closed the door. She said to Jamie, "Out, please, just for the bath. You may stand in the corridor. The bond will not break for an hour's wall between you." Jamie hesitated. The wolf had lain down across the threshold of the inner chamber, head on its paws, and was watching Emma with its pale eye. Jamie looked at the wolf. The wolf looked back. Some understanding passed between them that Emma could not read, but Sally apparently could, because Sally snorted softly and said, "Men," and the priestess almost smiled. Jamie went out. The door closed. The women bathed her. They were gentle. They did not speak of the collar, though Sally's fingers paused at it once and then moved on. They washed her hair 3 times and combed it out, and put her in a robe of soft gray wool that fit because someone, somewhere, had been keeping her measurements. And they sat her by the fire with a bowl of broth, and Sally fed her the first 3 spoonfuls because her hands were shaking too hard. The priestess sat across from her on a low stool and watched her eat, and then said when the bowl was half gone, "Child, the collar. Tell me with the slate everything you remember." Emma told her. It took a long time, because the slate was small and the chalk wore down, and Sally had to fetch another, and twice Emma's hand cramped and she had to stop. She wrote the village. She wrote the Lord's name. She wrote the velvet box. She wrote the letter and the seal. She wrote Garland's name and underlined it twice. She wrote what she had seen on the 7th week, Garland in the doorway with his lamp, looking for the wolf. And she wrote what she had understood and not been able to say. The priestess read each slate without speaking, and wiped it clean and handed it back. When Emma was done, the priestess sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "The collar was made to do 2 things. To take your voice, and to make sure that if the wolf came and chose, the Luna it chose could not speak its name aloud, could not call for help, could not name the man who would come for its hide." Emma nodded once. She had known. She had known for at least 4 weeks. The priestess saw her face and said, gently, "You knew." Emma nodded again. The priestess said, "Then you are cleverer than every man on the council, child, and that is not as high praise as it should be." Sally laughed, a single sharp sound, and then put her hand over her mouth again. The priestess stood. "The collar I cannot remove tonight. The rune is old, and it is keyed to the Maker's blood, which means I would need him in the room and willing, and he will not be willing. But I can dull it. I can make it cool. I can give you, perhaps, a word at a time. Will you allow me?" Emma considered. She wrote on the slate, "What is the cost?" The priestess looked at her with the first open respect she had shown all night. "The cost is mine to pay. A year of my sight, perhaps. I am old. I have seen enough." Emma wrote, "No." The priestess looked at her. Emma wrote, "Not for 1 word." The priestess was quiet a long moment. Then she said, "Then we wait. The bond will work on it from the other side. A true bond does not tolerate a forced silence between mates. It will fray the rune. slowly, from within. By the time it is done, the Maker will already be answering for it. Emma nodded. She set the slate down. She looked at the door. The priestess saw the look and said, dry, "Yes, he has not moved. He has been standing with his shoulder against the wood for the entire hour. I expect he has not breathed properly the whole time. Shall I let him in?" Emma nodded. The priestess opened the door. Jaime came in. He had taken off his cloak somewhere. His hair was wet, as if he had finally put his head under a basin in the corridor. He came across the room and stopped a careful arm's length from her chair and went down on one knee, which Sally made a small, offended sound at, and which the priestess did not stop. And he looked at her and said, "I did not know." Emma reached for the slate. She wrote, "I know." He read it. He closed his eyes a moment. The wolf, from the threshold, made the low not sound again, and the tuning fork ringing started at the back of Emma's jaw and stopped before it became anything. And she saw, by the small movement of Jaime's throat, that it had started and stopped in him at the same instant. Neither of them said anything about it. They did not need to. The night went strangely after that. The priestess took up a post in the antechamber and would not be moved. Sally went to fetch more bread and did not come back for nearly an hour. And when she came back, her face was set in a way Emma recognized. The face Sally wore when she had been listening at a door she should not have been listening at. And she came straight to Emma and bent to her ear and whispered, "The elder scholar has sent 3 messages tonight already. 1 to the southern garrison, 1 to a cousin in the merchant quarter, and 1 to a man at the dockside who is known to keep a fast horse." Emma nodded. Sally added, lower, "And he has not slept. He is in his study with the door barred, and there is a smell coming under it that I do not like." Emma wrote on the slate, "What smell?" Sally read it and said, "Like a forge. Like hot iron." Emma's hand went to her throat without her meaning it to. Jaime saw the motion. He did not ask. He stood from the hearth where he had been sitting on the floor like a guard dog for the past 2 hours, and went to the door of the antechamber, and spoke briefly to the priestess, and came back and said to Emma, "I'm going to have him brought to me. Now. Tonight. I will not let him sit in that room and forge a second one." Emma reached for the slate, fast. She wrote, "No." He stopped. She wrote, "He will not come quietly. He will run. And if he runs, we will not find the books. He has 30 years of books. We need the books." Jamie read it twice. He looked at her. He said, slowly, "You have thought about this?" She wrote, "For 4 weeks." He breathed out through his nose and almost smiled. And it was the first almost smile she had seen on him. And it changed his face in a way that made her have to look down at the slate for a moment. He said, "Then tell me how." She wrote, "Send Sally with a tray. Tell him you are sleeping. Tell him the priestess has gone to bed. Tell him the wolf is at peace and the question can wait till dawn. Let him believe he has till morning. Then at the 3rd bell, before the kitchens wake, go through his door with the priestess and 4 men you trust and not the captain of the guard. The captain visits him on the long evenings. He has been visiting him for years." Jamie read it. He said, very quietly, "I have been a fool." She wrote, "You have been at war. There is a difference." He looked at her over the slate. He said, "Emma, She looked up. He said, "I am sorry." She wrote, "For what?" He said, "For the fact that the first thing my kingdom did to you in my name was put iron on your throat, and the second thing was leave it there for 3 years while I wrote a border." She wrote, "You did not put it on me." He said, "I did not take it off either." She held his eyes. She wrote, "You are taking it off now." He read it. He did not answer. He turned and went to speak to Sally, and Sally took up a tray and went out. And Emma sat by the fire with the wolf's head now resting across her feet and the moth on her shoulder, and thought, with the careful, private clarity she had thought in for 3 years, that she had perhaps been wrong about what loving a man would feel like. She had thought it would feel like the Lord in the Square, the smile and the parchment and the velvet box. It did not feel like that. It felt like being seen at the same moment as being believed. It felt like a hand offered without an angle. The tuning fork ringing started in her teeth, and she let it. And across the room, Jamie's hand paused half a second on the back of a chair, and she filed it, and did not let herself feel it. Not yet. Sally returned. She had given the tray. Garland had taken it. He had said, "My dear Sally, how kind," and had asked after the king's rest in a voice she did not like. He had not invited her in. She had seen, through the crack of the door, parchments laid out on his desk and a small iron crucible by his foot. Jamie listened. He nodded. He went to the antechamber and roused the priestess and named 4 men by their first names, none of them the captain of the guard. And one of them was a young lieutenant called Reese, which Emma noted with a small private bend in her chest, because Reese was not an uncommon name in this kingdom, and the lieutenant was not her brother. But the sound of it went down through her like a thread pulled taut. The men were sent for. They came up the back stair quietly. They were given their orders in the antechamber in low voices, and Emma sat in her chair and watched the wolf stars drift, and felt the fire warm the side of her face, and understood that she had moved, in the course of a single evening, from a woman who carried chamber pots to a woman whose written word moved soldiers. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired. She also felt, with a clarity that surprised her, ready. The 3rd bell rang. The men went down the back stair with Jamie at their head and the priestess at his elbow, and the wolf, to Emma's surprise, padding silent behind. Sally stayed with Emma. Sally took her hand. They sat by the fire and did not speak, because Sally understood that Emma's not speaking was not because she could not tonight, but because there was nothing in the world that needed saying. The moth on Emma's shoulder lifted abruptly and flew once around the room and settled on the back of Sally's hand. Sally went very still. Then she said, soft, "Oh." Then she said, "Well?" And she squeezed Emma's hand once and they waited. What happened in Garland's study Emma learned only in pieces, because she was not there, and because Jamie, when he came back, was not yet ready to speak of it in full, and because the priestess, when she finally sat down by the fire near dawn, sat for a long time before she said anything at all. The pieces were these. The door had not been barred when they reached it. It had been ajar. Garland had been standing at his desk with his back to them and his hands in a basin of water that was steaming faintly, and he had not turned around when they came in. He had said, without turning, "Ah, the wolf. I had wondered if you would bring it." Jamie had said, "You will face the wall." Garland had said, "My king, I think we are past walls." He had turned. His hands had been red to the wrists. On the desk behind him had been spread the parchments Sally had glimpsed, and they had been not, as everyone in the keep had assumed for 30 years, scholarly transcriptions of old hymns. They had been diagrams, anatomies, methods. The Starlight wolf as a body to be unmade. Pages and pages of how to harvest, how to render, how to store, how to sell. Some of the diagrams were old, browned at the edges. Some were fresh, the ink still wet enough that the lamplight caught it. On the desk beside the parchments had been the iron crucible Sally had seen. Inside the crucible, half-formed, had been a second collar. Smaller than Emma's, finer. The rune on it had not yet been completed. Garland had been carving the last stroke when they came in. He had said, conversationally, while the priestess walked the perimeter of the room and Reese, the young lieutenant, blocked the door behind them. "You should understand, my king, that I have done this for the kingdom. The wolf is a finite resource. To leave it in a single body that wanders the wilds and dies in some ditch every generation is waste. To distribute its essence, properly rendered, into the bloodlines of the loyal nobility, that is statecraft. That is what your father refused to understand. That is what I have been preparing to offer you when the time was right." He had spread his red hands. He had said, "The girl is unfortunate. I had not planned for the wolf to bond before I could collect it. The collar was a precaution. I am a man who plans for precautions." Jamie had said, very quietly, "You put iron on a child's throat for refusing a man she did not want." Garland had inclined his head. "A small price for the larger work, my king. She has had 3 years of useful service. Many girls do not have so much." Jamie had moved. The priestess had said sharply, "No," and Jamie had stopped, his hand already on his sword. The priestess had said, "His blood is in that crucible. If you spill it on the floor, the rune on the girl's throat may take." Jamie had not moved. He had said, through his teeth, "Then what?" The priestess had said, "The crucible. Cap it. Then take him." Reese, the young lieutenant, had stepped forward, with a square of leather already in his hand, because Reese had been listening too, and had capped the crucible, and had set it aside on a shelf where it would not be knocked. Garland had watched this with the same patient half-smile. He had said, "You have all done very well. I shall make a full account to the council in the morning." The priestess had said, "You will make no account to anyone. You will sit." Garland had not sat. He had reached, slowly, into his sleeve. Out of his sleeve had come, not a knife, as everyone in the room had expected, but a single, small, luminous moth. He had held it on his palm. He had said, "Watch." He had closed his hand. The moth had not been crushed. It had passed through his fingers as if his fingers were mist, and had flown up and had circled his head and had not landed on him. It had flown to Reese, the young lieutenant, and landed on his collar and lifted again and flown to the priestess's staff and rested there a moment and lifted again and gone out the door, down the corridor, and, Emma learned later, all the way up the back stair to her own chamber and through the crack under her own door and to her shoulder, where it had landed as Sally squeezed her hand. Garland had watched the moth go. His face had done a thing then that the priestess described later only as the face of a man who has been told by something small and silent that he is already lost. He had said, "Ah." He had sat down. The priestess had taken his hands behind his back, and the lieutenant had bound them, and Jamie had not, in the end, drawn his sword. Because the priestess had asked him not to, and because, Jamie said to Emma afterward, by then it had not felt necessary. They had taken him down to the cells. They had set a guard of 4 on the door, none of them men who had ever drunk wine in Garland's study. They had sealed the study itself with the priestess's mark. They had carried the crucible, capped, to the chapel, where it would sit under the priestess's eye until it could be safely unmade. They had come back up the stair as the first gray of dawn was coming in through the high windows of the keep, and Jamie had come into the chamber where Emma sat by the fire with Sally and the moth on her shoulder. And he had crossed the room and gone down on one knee again in front of her chair, and he had said, "It is done. He is in the cells. The books will be read by people I trust. The crucible is sealed." Emma had nodded. She had reached for the slate. She had written, "The second caller." He had said, "Smashed." She had nodded again. She had written, "Good." She had set the slate down. She had reached, slowly, and laid her hand against the side of his face, which she had not yet done, and his eyes had closed. The wolf by the hearth had made the low knot sound. The tuning fork ringing had started in Emma's teeth, and she had let it. And this time she did not file it, did not press it down, did not put it away for later study. She let it ring. Across her palm she felt his jaw work once, and the heat in the collar at her throat, which had been there for 3 years like a low band of weather, dropped, for the first time, by a degree she could measure. The days after were not what Emma had imagined in the years when she had let herself imagine anything. There was no parade. There was no public claiming in the great hall. The priestess had said, "The keep has had enough theater for 1 generation." And Jamie had agreed. And so what happened instead was quieter and, Emma thought, more useful. The 9 bridal candidates were sent home with formal apologies, generous dowries restored, and individual letters in Jamie's own hand. The treaty bride, whose name was Hesta, asked for an audience the second morning and was granted one. And she came in and sat across from Emma and Jamie in a small council room and said, plainly, "My pack signed the parchment in good faith, and we will release it in good faith, if your kingdom will commit to the trade terms regardless." And Jamie had looked at Emma, and Emma had nodded, and Jamie had said, "Done." Hesta had then looked directly at Emma and said, "You may keep the gown. It will fit you in a year when you are not so thin." Emma had laughed silently with her shoulders, and Hesta had almost smiled, and they had parted with the quiet mutual respect of 2 women who had each, in different ways, dodged a knife. The collar did not come off the 2nd day, or the 3rd, or the 4th. The priestess worked at it each evening, slowly, with cold water and old words, and a touch so light Emma could barely feel it. And each evening the iron grew a fraction cooler. And on the 5th night, Emma made a small dry sound that was not yet a word, but was the first sound her throat had made in 3 years. And she put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes filled. And Jamie, who had been sitting reading at the other side of the hearth, did not look up, because the priestess had told him not to. But Emma saw his hand go very still on the page, and she understood that he was giving her the moment to have alone. And she loved him for it in a way she could not yet write down. Reese, the young lieutenant, who was not her brother, was given a permanent posting outside her chamber door, and he stood it without complaint, and brought her, on the 3rd day, a folded square of paper that was a letter from her actual brother Reese in the village, who was 12 now, and who had written in a small, careful hand. They say at the market that the king has chosen a Luna who is from our village and who is mute. If it is you, please send a sign. If it is not you, please send a sign anyway, because Mother cannot sleep. Emma had sat with the letter a long time. She had written on a fresh sheet, "It is me. I am well. I am better than well. I will send for you when I can." She had given it to the Lieutenant Reese to send by fast writer, and she had watched him go down the corridor with it, and she had thought, "My brother will read my words again." The wolf did not leave her. It paced the chambers at night, lay across the foot of her bed during the day, drank water from a silver dish Sally set out, ignored the meat Jamie brought it, accepted with what Emma was almost sure was amusement, a single slice of brown bread offered from her hand at breakfast. The stars on its coat had slowed. They no longer orbited her exactly. They drifted between her and Jamie in a long, slow figure eight. And the priestess, watching this one evening from her stool, had said, "Ah," and not explained, and Emma had not asked, because she had begun to understand. The moth lived in the curtains of the window seat. It came out at dusk and flew each evening the same circuit, around Emma's head, around Jamie's head, around the wolf, around Sally when she was in the room, around the priestess. It did not land on the Lieutenant Reese, though it circled him politely. It did not land on the new chamberlain who had replaced Garland on the council, a tall, thin, nervous man named Ferris, until the fourth evening, at which point it landed on his sleeve and stayed there a full minute. And Jamie, watching, exhaled. And Emma knew the new chamberlain had passed a test no one had told him he was taking. Garland in his cell did not speak. He ate what was brought. He slept. He read the single book the priestess permitted him, which was a book of old hymns, the genuine kind. He asked once for paper and ink. He was refused. On the sixth day, a delegation from the council asked for an audience with the king to discuss the matter of trial, and Jamie received them with Emma at his right hand and the priestess at his left. And Emma wrote on a fresh slate the words, "Public trial, full reading of the books, every name spoken aloud, no exceptions for rank." And the priestess held up the slate so the council could see. And the council, after a long silence, had bowed and gone away to prepare it. On the seventh day, Sally brought Emma a small wooden box. Inside was a needle and a spool of clean white thread. Ordinary thread, not waxed, not soaked. Sally said, "For the gown, when you are ready to hem it." Emma had laughed her silent shoulder laugh and had taken the needle and had not used it yet, because there had not been time. But she had set the box on the mantel where she could see it. And the wolf, when it passed, had touched the box once with its nose, as if to say, "Yes, this too. This is also part of it." On the ninth night, the collar came off. It was not dramatic. The priestess had said that morning, "I think tonight, child." And Emma had nodded, and they had not made a ceremony of it. After supper, with the fire low and Jamie sitting where he had taken to sitting, on the floor with his back against her chair and the wolf's head on his knee, and Sally knitting in the corner, and the Lieutenant Reese in the corridor outside humming, very softly, a tune Emma half remembered from her village. The priestess had risen from her stool and had come to stand in front of Emma and had laid both hands on the collar and had spoken 3 words Emma did not understand. And the iron had simply opened. It did not break. It did not fall. It opened the way a flower opens, in 2 slow halves, and the priestess caught it as it came apart and set it gently on the table. The rune on the inside had gone dark. The priestess said, soft, "You can speak when you are ready, child." There is no hurry. Emma did not try at first. She sat very still and felt the air on her throat for the first time in 3 years, and registered, with a kind of distant astonishment, that her throat was simply a throat, that it did not hurt, that it was not warm, that no iron pressed it. She lifted one hand and touched the place where the collar had been. Her fingertips found bare skin, slightly calloused along the line where the iron had ridden, but unmarked. She breathed in, she breathed out. She tried in her head a word. She tried, my name. She did not say it aloud yet. She tried the word she had wanted to say to her brother in the square 3 years ago. She tried, sorry, no, the other one, the one she had actually wanted to say, which had been, wait. She tried in her head, thank you. She tried in her head, I am here. None of them came out. They sat in her mouth, ready, and she did not push. Jaime had not turned around. He was still sitting on the floor at her feet with the wolf's head on his knee. He was looking at the fire. He had not moved when the collar opened. Emma reached down and laid her hand on the top of his head. His hair was rough under her palm. He did not move. She felt him breathe, once, deeply, and she felt the tuning fork ringing start in her teeth, and she let it, and she leaned down and put her mouth near his ear and tried, very quietly, the smallest word she could think of. She said, Jaime. It came out hoarse. It came out cracked. It came out, and it was a word, her word, in her voice, the voice she had had when she was 17 and had said no in a village square, only older now and lower and used. Jaime did not move. He did not turn his head. He said, after a moment, in a voice that was not entirely steady, yes. She said, hello. He said, hello. Sally in the corner kept knitting and did not look up, because Sally was a woman of great practical kindness who knew when a moment was not for her. The priestess sat back down on her stool and folded her hands and closed her eyes and looked, for the first time all week, her age. The wolf made the low not sound and lifted its head from Jaime's knee and turned and pressed its luminous brow against Emma's throat, against the bare skin where the iron had been, and held it there. And Emma felt the stars on its coat slow and stop, and then begin to turn again, in a new pattern, not around her and not between her and Jaime, but in a wide, soft wheel that included them both, and the wolf, and the room, and the moth in the curtains, and Sally in the corner, and the humming young lieutenant in the corridor outside. Emma sat in the middle of the wheel with her hand on Jaime's head and the wolf's brow at her throat, and tried, silently, one more word. She tried, mine. It did not come out. It did not need to. Days later, and it was only days, 3 of them, 4 perhaps, Emma was not yet keeping that kind of count. She was in the kitchen garden behind the keep with Sally and the Leighton Reese, who had been pressed into service carrying a basket, because Sally had decided that idle guards were a waste of good shoulders. The morning was cold but not bitter. There was no snow yet. The herbs in the low beds were past their season, but there were still rosemary and thyme and a stubborn clump of sage that had refused to die, and Sally was pinching sprigs off it with the businesslike pleasure of a woman who had been kept out of her own garden for too long. Emma was crouched by the sage with her sleeves pushed up. She had on a plain wool dress, not the gown, which still hung in the chamber waiting to be hemmed. Her throat was bare. Her hair was loose. The wolf was nowhere in sight, which had become the new normal. It came and went now, and when it was away she did not worry, because the tuning fork ringing in her teeth came at small intervals all through the day, and she had learned to read it, the way other women read the weather. And she could tell that the wolf was somewhere on the keep grounds, mildly bored, possibly napping in a sunny spot on the south wall. Jamie came down the path from the keep with 2 cups in his hands. He had taken to bringing her tea in the mornings himself, which had at first scandalized the kitchens, and now merely amused them. He stopped at the edge of the bed and held out 1 cup. Emma stood and took it. Their fingers touched. "Sage," she said. Her voice was still hoarse, still finding itself. She used it sparingly, mostly with him, occasionally with Sally, once, memorably, to thank the priestess, who had cried, which had then made Sally cry, which had then made Emma laugh, which had been a new sound, and one she was getting used to. Jamie looked down at the sprigs in her other hand. 4 eggs. He considered this. "We have eggs?" "We have eggs," said Sally from 3 beds over, without looking up. "Because some of us went down to the hen house this morning at an hour that men do not believe in." Jamie acknowledged this with a small bow in Sally's direction. Sally ignored him. Emma drank her tea. It was too hot. She set it on the low wall of the bed to cool. She crouched again and went back to the sage. Jamie crouched beside her. He did not help. He watched her hands. After a moment, he said, low, "Your thumbs have healed." Emma looked at her thumbs. The small pricks from 9 weeks of stitching were faded to thin white lines, almost gone. "Yes." "Good." She glanced at him. He was looking at her hands the way a man looks at a thing he has decided to be careful with for the rest of his life. She felt the tuning fork ringing start in her teeth, very faint, very brief, and she let it pass without remark, because she had decided to use the bond signature sparingly, the way the priestess used her old words, and she had already counted, in her private, practical way, that she had felt it deliberately twice already in this story of her own life, and she would allow herself one more, at a moment of her own choosing, and not before. She finished pinching the sage. She stood up. She handed half the sprigs to Jamie, because his hands were idle, and she had been raised to put idle hands to use. He took them gravely. They walked back up the path together. Sally and the Lieutenant Reese came behind with the basket. The moth, which had taken to riding in the folds of Emma's collar, where there was no longer any iron to bother it, lifted briefly and circled her head and settled again. At the kitchen door, Sally took the sage from both of them and shooed them out. Because, she said, 2 royals underfoot in a working kitchen was 1.5 royals too many. Jamie and Emma went and sat on the low stone bench by the herb garden wall, where the morning sun was just beginning to warm the flags. They did not speak for a while. Emma drank her tea. It was now the right temperature. The wolf came around the corner of the wall at an unhurried trot, stars trailing slowly, and sat down at her feet and leaned its luminous shoulder against her shin. She put her free hand on its head. The fur was warm and not quite solid. The moth on her collar opened its wings once and closed them. Far off, in the keep, a bell rang for the changing of the watch. Jamie said, quiet, "Are you all right?" It was not a large question. He had asked it before. He would ask it again. She had learned that this was how he loved, in small, frequent questions that did not require large answers. She thought about it. She thought about her brother Reese, who was coming next week, who would walk into the keep gates and see her and either burst into tears or pretend, with 12-year-old dignity, that he had not. She thought about Garland in his cell, awaiting his trial, which would be held in 7 days in the Great Hall, with the doors open to anyone who wished to come, and which she would attend, and at which she would speak, in her own voice, the names of every harm done to her and to others by his hand. She thought about the gown on its hanger, which she would hem herself, with the white thread from Sally's box, in the evenings, by the fire, 1 stitch at a time, the way she had learned to do anything that mattered. She thought about the wolf at her feet, and the moth at her collar, and the man beside her, and the warm flags under her shoes, and the small, ordinary fact that there was sage in her hand and tea in her cup, and the morning was not yet over. She said, "Yes." Jamie nodded. He did not look at her. He took a slow sip of his tea. Down at her feet, the wolf made the low "not" sound, and Emma felt the tuning fork ringing start in her teeth, the 3rd and last time she would let herself notice it. And she leaned, very slightly, against Jamie's shoulder, and the ringing settled into a single, sustained, clear note, and held, and faded, and was gone. And what was left in its place was simply her own pulse, and his beside it, going about the steady, ordinary work of being alive. There were a few moments in this one that stayed with me. The needle going through light in the cold of the undercroft, the moth choosing whose sleeve to leave and whose shoulder to find, the small hoarse hello at the fire when the iron came apart. I'd love to know which one landed for you. See you next time.